Guys, I think we should get started, so thanks for coming. This is another one of our brain talk series. Today we're talking about concussion and mild TBI, mild brain injuries. And we do these talks about once a month across the different offices. All the big offices have a talk, St. Louis, Los Angeles, and Orange County. And these are free and open informational talks, and we're always happy to take suggestions for content. I have about 10 or 15 talks that I cycle through and improve every year. But I'm always happy to learn something new and dig into new things. So if there's stuff you want to learn about, ask, and we'll maybe schedule a talk on that topic in the future. So thanks for coming. Of course, this is Peak Brain St. Louis. You guys are currently sitting in the meditation room. So every Monday night, this becomes a meditation space. It's a free class, completely wide open, no charge. Don't RSVP, just show up and sit down at 7:30. It's a very low-key group, nothing to believe, no chanting, no incense. Just basic meditation techniques taught in a very low-key way with a few people. So please feel free to come and participate in that. It does work counter to concussion damage sometimes. Not usually acute damage. If you're really post-concussive and things are really foggy, meditation will probably just bring anxiety up, especially if you have some anxiety under the covers. But if you aren't anxious and you're still a little foggy a few months later, meditation can improve concussion a little bit. So what is it? What is concussion? Essentially, it's a force the brain receives that changes the structure or the function of the brain. Usually there's inflammation involved, and often there are tissue issues and damage. Either low-key tissue damage that's in one location, focal damage, or you can have diffuse damage, sort of impacts that move throughout the brain, or you can have shearing or twisting damage generally. If you receive your impact while you're moving in space, you often get the two sides of the brain or parts get pulled away from other parts. So that can also produce concussive type symptoms, although it's not strictly speaking a concussion. It's just a TBI, a brain injury. We're going to define some terms. mTBI is mild TBI, not that uncommon. Talk about the rates of incidence, the causes of concussions, some of the deficits that show up in concussions, as well as some immediate and later consequences, and how that produces some executive function changes, and then some interventions you can do to change your brain. You'll see I'm using a lot of sports imagery in this slide set because that is one of the most common ways we get injured. It's by no means the only way we get injured. We get injured a lot from just falling over, actually. It's really quite common to get concussion from falling down, oddly enough. Car accidents, I think, are the number one reason we get brain injuries in this country, but sports are coming up fast on that percentage, especially if you consider low-key, so subacute wear and tear that we now know does produce damage in sports. So our knowledge about concussion is changing. When I was growing up, we were told that unless you lost consciousness, you didn't have a concussion, which is not true. In fact, 50% of all brain injuries are quote-unquote silent. There's no symptoms right away. And the brain's happy to sort of re-regulate and not deal with any acute symptoms, but there might be some structural or tissue damage, and up to 10 years later, symptoms might show up. And classic symptoms from post-concussion stuff usually are brain fog, fatigue, and irritability as the core cluster. Then you often get other things like lack of deep sleep, some chronic anxiety can come up, often difficulty with sustained focus, where you really fatigue, especially visual tasks, if you have any back of the brain involvement. So we used to think that, you get hit on the court, or you fall off your bike, or you get in a car accident, your day, shrug it off, walk it off. And now we know that any impact of the head is probably causing some damage, and there's really no safe level of impact. We're finding more and more evidence of this in sports. There was one study a couple of years ago that followed some high school soccer players and looked at a heading drill, 20 times into the net. And they measured their levels of GABA neurotransmitters afterwards for inflammation. They measured some and performed a memory test. And they had massive shifts for 24 hours in neurotransmitters and a 75% drop in memory performance for immediately after the heading the ball into the net, as an average across the whole team. It's an acute effect. No one's followed what happens later on in those types of injuries, so we don't know if it's acute or transient. Other injuries, football players. A study a couple of years ago took one of the last middle schools in the country that had tackle football. Almost every middle school now is flag or touch football in this country, but high school we still have tackle, some places, actually many places. But most below high school are now non-contact. There's 1 or 2 school districts left doing contact football. 3 researchers followed the whole team for a whole season and did neuroimaging at several points throughout the season. And at the end of the season, they picked 3 kids who had never played a game. They rode the bench the whole season, but they practiced with the team. These 3 kids all had evidence of CTE in their brain, little seeds of brain injuries like NFL players get. Never playing a game, just hitting the dummies and doing the drills, and the wear and tear accumulated over a single football season. So this is a much bigger deal than we realize. There's basically no safe level of head impact. I predict we won't have football as a national pastime in the next decade or 2. As it is now, high school teams are having trouble finding kids sometimes. Divisions are closing because the number of parents willing to have their kids risk this stuff is dropping. Here's an example of a concussion. This is maybe from whiplash. If you're in a car, the car simply stops, you go forward, and the brain continues after the head stops. So the chest belt grabs you, then you stop, the brain will continue and bounce off the front of the head. This is actually one of the easiest ways to damage the brain is from the front. The interior surface of the skull kind of holds the brain still, if you will, gives it things to rest on, but the back is smooth. So if you fall back, the brain kind of deforms a little bit and doesn't damage that much, but the front is like little spiky fingers almost, ridges, holding the frontal lobe in place, kind of like over the cab of a truck. So if you land in the front, you run up against non-smooth bone, and you have like lots of like bony protrusions that can push the brain around against that force. So frontal impact's often a much bigger deal than falling back. I mentioned this already, but you can have multiple kinds of injuries. In a force impact, you have generally a crush injury, and the part of the cortex or the brain that gets impacted tends to not be sure what to do. It's kind of bruised and inflamed, and drops back into the default sort of heartbeat of the brain, which is a wave called delta, about 2 to 3 times per second. And the brainstem tends to run in delta to do all the autonomic stuff. You don't think in delta, you sort of live in delta. Deep sleep, dreamless sleep is delta waves. Washing the brain free of toxins at night through agitating your cerebrospinal fluid is a delta phenomena. Deep dreamless sleep, delta. Consolidating short to long-term memories is a delta component. So delta is a really like deep frequency for the body, and if it's showing up when you're awake, it means you're very sleepy or foggy, or the part of the brain that's showing it isn't waking up when you're awake, which we might guess is from scar tissue or concussion or something like that. So again, impact produces a little dysregulated area that then defaults back to the delta sort of brainstem frequency. In contrast, a shearing injury might pull part of the brain away from another part, and then you break what's called inhibitory connections into that region. There's no more breaks going into one little region, and that region will run very, very fast. So it'll be high in beta waves. So 2 different types of phenomena. The slowest brainwave, delta, shows up for reductions in circulation or scar tissue. And beta, the fast brainwaves, show up excessively if part of the brain is no longer touching or connected to other parts. So you can have both very, very slow and very fast brainwave excesses as a function of the injury, the type of injury. We also tend to get inflammation as a function of the brain injury. And this is a good thing because inflammatory cytokines and all kinds of things rush in to make the tissue stiff if it's been impacted. And this prevents the tissue from changing further under the damage, hopefully. The problem is that many people don't receive one single concussion and then recover from it. The tissue's still inflamed, still brittle, still stiff. And then you go back to play or you get another concussion. And often a second concussion within several weeks of the first one, even a very mild impact, can cause dramatic damage because the tissue's inflamed and therefore sort of rigid. Another concussion, the force travels through the entire tissue body, not just the region of jelly where it hits. It often causes a much more diffuse injury, and injuries often last much longer and are more severe even with a less impact.
So are there certain parts of the brain where one, I guess, type here will be more prevalent than the other? Because you mentioned, like, for example, frontal lobe.
Yeah, well, you get cortical injuries from crush, and you can get both cortical top surface as well as axonal deeper injuries for shear. Because the shearing injuries will be deeper and pull the tissue away, but a crush tends to just be the surface hitting other surfaces. So, but injuries and accidents are quite variable. I had a client come in earlier today who had an injury and some spinal stuff, and it turned out it was an electrocution that caused it. She had a car accident with electrocution on top of it. So you can have, people don't have one injury. They come in because they got in a car accident or they had, a football player history for 5 years. There's lots of very history of stuff when we look at your brain. We often see damage if there's a reason for it. The other thing that happens with this crush impact is what's called a coup contra coup injury. This is very common in whiplash. Again, the chest belt hits you, your brain hits the front of the lobe, and then you go back, and the brain hits the back of the skull, and you end with opposite corners. So in significant damage on EEGs, we often see that the opposite corners of the skull have little involvement that suggests injury, or a stripe of connectivity through the brain will be altered that tracks the line of force you experienced, essentially. Neurologists will say you should be at least 2 weeks symptom-free before stressing your brain out again, physically or mentally. So you shouldn't be studying for the GRE or the SATs or the licensing exam with a concussion. You should actually let your brain rest mentally as well as physically. I don't want you riding a bike, I don't want you skiing, or anything else for a couple of weeks post-symptom. And concussions can take weeks and months and years to lift, so people often are risking further damage because they're going to push through it. But you can't push through concussions. You have to let them resolve. Or do things to resolve them faster, like neurofeedback.
So I've had a concussion before, and I had some similar advice, and I was told not to look at anything that was bright. And I guess it's the best word for it. Is that the same reason? It just elicits.
Yeah, people tend to fatigue a lot visually. It won't hurt your brain per se, but it may fatigue it from recovering faster. Yeah, a lot of visual fatigue, a lot of stamina issues. You can kind of think of it in the same category as the brain being half asleep, and so it's just hard to stay on. So you should give yourself plenty of rest time. Visual activation is a metabolically expensive thing to do. It activates a huge amount back in the brain, so it tends to be a real metabolic drain to sit there and stare at screens or work hard visually. So it's really obvious it taxes you. You often get some sensory sensitivity too with concussions, light sensitivity, vestibular changes, and so the strong input of light can really trigger those. That's my guess about why they suggest you don't do that. So here's an example of what happens. This is shearing or twisting. So this happens a lot to bicyclists who get injured and they're moving really fast and get crashed another bicyclist and they're thrown. And they end up like spinning through the air as they land. That produces this kind of damage because the brain is being torqued when you land. And that does a lot more damage, a lot more diffuse damage than does a crush injury, actually. It's often not as visible in imaging or an EEG, but it often causes a lot more deep, long-term damage because it's diffuse, not just a little area. It's kind of throughout the whole brain, or it can be anyways. And then in contrast, crush injuries tend to push on the brain. You get altered tissue in one little area with inflammatory cytokines and inflammatory things showing up. And you do get some neuronal changes, and this can produce connectivity changes here, but it's really the surface that we're seeing on a brain map or an EEG. We're seeing large amounts of delta and theta brainwaves right there, because those areas of the brain are not waking up fully, so they're stuck in this sort of slow, sleepy brainwave mode. Concussion, TBI, mild TBI have a cluster of symptoms. They're variable across people, and not every person experiences the same thing. And even mild injuries can produce severe symptoms, and severe symptoms might only produce severe injuries might only produce mild symptoms. You can't necessarily determine how much tissue damage there is based on what you experience. You just kind of know where your resource bottlenecks are, probably. We almost always get executive function issues in concussion, including things like inhibition or being impulsive or reactive, especially. Working memory, or the amount of things you can hold in your mind, sometimes gets pretty shot with concussion. Instead of the normal human range is 5 to 9 items, about 7 items plus or minus 2 is how many things we can hold in our mind. And with concussion, you might lose a couple of those items, where you just can't sustain your focus in the things you're thinking about. Memory, not just working memory or RAM, but memory recall can be really quite problematic. Sometimes a slowdown of the tissue, so it's hard to grab memory out of your brain, even though it might still be there. And that's actually driven by this speed of processing. Your alpha wave speed tends to slow down with concussion or sleep issues or diffuse low-key wear and tear or developmental issues. You have a slower brain sometimes. And you can see this as how fast your alpha waves are. And it really means how fast you're processing. This happens in concussion, but it also happens in aging. So if you get 7 years old and you're having some word-finding issues, it's probably not a memory issue, unless it's obvious. It's probably a speed of processing. You can't grab the word fast enough. And those of you who have concussions, the same thing happens. You're like, I'm still feeling the brain fog. You reach for a word, and you can't quite grab the word. And you reach for it, and it's just not there. And then you stop reaching for it, and it pops into your mind easily. That's a speed of processing issue, not a memory issue, even though it feels like a memory access problem. It's better that it's not a memory issue. It's more easily changed. We often get sleep changes with concussion. If your brain is being made, if you will, to make more delta than average because of an impact, delta is a sleepy brainwave, a deeply rested, non-dreaming brainwave. So if you're in delta all day long because you're foggy and fatigued, and then you lie down to go to bed, your brain doesn't know how to go into deep delta because it's been in delta all day long when you've been awake. So I often tell people who have some concussion history, my guess is you feel kind of awake when you're asleep and asleep when you're awake and kind of stuck between those two states all the time. You're not able to quite fully wake up crisply, and then when it's time to go to bed, you can't go all the way down into sleep, and you kind of wake up in the morning unrested. Essentially, your energy regulation has been thrown off, and you aren't cycling through energy changes the way you need to, and you're stuck in this weird kind of in-between mode. Anxiety is often a symptom too. I don't know if this is what I call a primary symptom or secondary. I see anxiety creeping up over many years when there's significant concussion or TBI damage, and I think it might be compensatory to not be able to focus or feel as clear or as alert or as aware as you might want to be, so you kind of ramp up the resources, and that ends up being very stressful over time.
So,
well, it's in the short term, that strategy might be compensatory or coping driven. Ramp yourself up so you actually can deal with driving or your job. But yes, over time, it actually takes your resources out. And driving your stress up that much to overwhelm the brain fog usually means anxiety stuff starts to creep up. The depth of sleep degrades further because sleep maintenance or depth is driven to some extent by anxiety or lack of anxiety. So if you're anxious, you can't let go of the world and go deep. So it's sort of a vicious cycle where once you have some anxiety and poor sleep, those two things tend to reinforce each other until you're just chronically underrested and burnt. That's the clinical term. Cognitive fatigue is often a longer term symptom. I don't mean tiredness here. Cognitive fatigue is a sense of, I can't, no, I can't, leave me alone. It's 2 p.m. and I'm done making decisions. Nope. So it's not, again, tiredness, but a sense of being unable to activate a specific resource. Sometimes changes in personality with even mild. This is not a mild case here. This is the classic brain injury guy that's in all the psychology textbook. Phineas Gage was a locomotive track foreman when we were putting tracks to the Rockies and things. And he ran a group of guys, blasting rocks out and tamping dynamite into rocks and doing everything. And back then, we drilled holes, dropped some dynamite in, and used a metal rod to tamp the dynamite down. And when he did that, he had a blasting cap. The rod went straight back up out of the hole and went through the orbital ridge and came out the top of his head. And he lost vision in that eye. But after they removed the rod, he was fine. He had no risk of health issues. But before that, he was known as the sweetest, most kind, religious, conscientious, careful guy. After that, hard drinking, swearing, womanizing guy who was locked up every other weekend. Massive personality change from a right front injury. This happens very often in frontal injuries. If they're very severe, people get very disinhibited, hypersexual, unable to resist their impulses. Sorry?
I said, manic.
Manic can happen too. Manic can happen. Mania is a higher level human sort of experience. What I'm talking about is simply the anterior temporal lobe resources. If you shut off this part of the brain, you become disinhibited, and all things behind it drive your behavior. Seeking sex and food and alcohol and being very impulsive. It's a specific brain injury or a syndrome called kluverbucy syndrome, which people can get for various reasons: brain injuries, disease, or infections causing change in the anterior temporal lobe. It's just sometimes with injuries, and Phineas Gage may have had a variant of kluverbucy syndrome based on his behavior change.
Temporal lobe or frontal lobe?
It's the temporofrontal junction. It's just behind the insula, so it would be temporal lobe in terms of where the damage is, I think, but not especially well validated in terms of where and why. So with animal models, it's very easy. You cut off the front half, the temporal lobe, they all develop kluverbucy syndrome, or primates. But in humans more variable, so I'm not sure that we have a good sense beyond somewhere in the anterior temporal lobe. We can have acute deficits, so this is say acute versus or focal versus diffuse deficits. You may have just general brain fog, nothing else going on. I'm working with a guy right now who had a massive concussion at the end of the year, the last week of the year, and he felt really, really bad the first 3 weeks of the year. And now he's like, I'm feeling great. He's taking a week off and going skiing again in 2 weeks.
Oh.
And that's how he got his concussion. He's like, people tell me I shouldn't go skiing again. What do you think? Well, you probably shouldn't go skiing again.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do, because he feels fine now. He's actually 2 weeks post symptoms. So neurologist would tell him he's fine. As long as your neurologist says you're fine, who might argue? But if you fall down on the slopes next week, do not do it again. Like the rest of the week, or sitting in the ski lodge drinking cocoa or something, because a second injury, sir, will really take you out functionally right now. But he thought he's fine because he's had a little tiny bit of brain fog, not waking up in the morning all that rested him, But it's not a huge issue for him, so he's like, I'm fine. But you might not be. You have a loss of consciousness, LOC, in about 1 out of 20 concussions and TBIs, moderate or mild TBIs. Open head injuries usually cause loss of consciousness. But closed head injuries and concussions, 5% of the time, significant tissue damage, and only 5% of the time is loss of consciousness. I mentioned this already, half of all injuries are silent and do not produce symptoms for 10 years. This is driven by there's a big heart study called the Framingham study, which followed many, many people starting in like the 40s or something, and looked at risk factors for cardiovascular disease. But the Framingham study, first it was men, and then it was men and their spouses, and now it's like multiple generations of those families being tracked across many things. So it started off as a cardiovascular health study for like smoking risk and stuff, but now they followed multiple generations, and they're looking at the kids of the Framingham health people, and they tracking, because these families are tracked pretty heavily, they can tell when there's an injury and when there's symptoms. 10 years later, symptoms are showing up for some of them. So it's a very delayed effect sometimes.
So with the loss of consciousness, is that actually considered a measure of?
No longer.
So it's no longer a measure of?
No, it's considered, it might be considered a measure of severity. You walk in the ER and they ask you that, you say yes, they're gonna assume it's a worse concussion than no. But I'm not sure a neurologist would think that, or a neuroscientist would think that, but an ER doc might. And there's probably some validity there, but I'm not sure. It's a measure. And there's lots of ways to lose consciousness that aren't all that severe, So probably it's a severity indication, but you can certainly have a severe concussion with no loss of consciousness. So it's sort of these it's not a sufficient criteria. Mentioned this, industrial accidents, sports, and motor vehicles are really common reasons for having concussions. Most of the industrial accidents are happening in men. Why do you think that is? That most of the workplace concussions are men.
Because the majority men.
Because the majority of industrial jobs are run by men, exactly. Sports. Do I have this here? Women actually receive more damage from concussion in sports than men do. They're more likely to get injured. Let's get a different slide. I'll get that to in a minute. 2 million Americans per year get injured with either mTBI or concussion. Most of these are concussions. I mentioned this already. Here's the study. Davenport and Aptarian in 2016. One single season of football, the kids that rode the bench show CTE changes. Concussions are 10% of sports injuries according to the Centers for Disease Control, and that's of the injuries reported. So this number must be higher. In the ER visit, 1.7 million visits every year for concussion. Half of them are for kids 14 or below. So it's not an adult problem. Kids get concussed pretty easily. 15% of total TBIs are motor vehicle accidents. And in elders, 40% of them are simple falls. 40% of brain injuries are simple falls. It's a big deal. All right, athletes, post-concussion syndrome. 90% roughly of young athletes will recover with no symptoms in about a week with concussions. Doesn't mean there isn't some change in the tissue, but there's no real symptoms. Those who don't recover, that 10%, will have symptoms lasting for weeks or months, and some people do not recover from concussion syndrome stuff. Concussion syndrome, again, being fog, fatigue, irritability, lack of rest from sleep, that kind of stuff. This is a big problem. High school has a lot more people playing sports than any other school, so I'm using statistics from high school grades to get a sense of how bad this is. Here are the number of NFL players in the leagues, and here's the number of people playing high school football and other related sports. Way more people are at risk, kids are at risk from injuries from high school sports than all the NFL combined, right? And I have no problem with an NFL guy getting paid $20 million a year for risking his own brain for concussion. I think that's his own choice. I'm not a big fan of that. I wouldn't do that myself. But people can absolutely make this call themselves. It's this I'm concerned about. All the high school kids who are setting themselves up for concussion damage. And I bet a lot of their parents do not know that sending your girl to play basketball increases your risk of concussion significantly, or soccer, or whatever else. 90% of all soccer, says football, and this is Polish from a British slide, 90% of all soccer injuries in 2009 were concussions. There are likely at least 100,000 concussions in high school athletes per year, based on the reported amount for the CDC, extended to the number of kids in high school sports. Reported. This is probably twice as high if I had to guess. So we only have 1,600 NFL players. How many kids are getting concussions every year compared to them? Again, not just a football player. Here's the injury rate per 100,000 players in high school sports. Football, which of course is almost entirely boys in this country, it's 47 people out of 100,000 that get injured. Girls soccer, 36. Boys soccer, 22. Look at that, 36 versus 22. 36 girls are getting injured with concussions out of 100,000 versus only 22 boys. And the boys in high school are bigger than the girls are, almost invariably, right? They're more physically large. So this is not about, the big athletes hitting each other, or this number will be higher. Women appear to be a little bit more at risk for damage from concussions than men do. For impact
more likely to report symptoms. Is this a reporting issue or?
Great thing, man. Yeah, this may be a reporting thing that girls may notice symptoms more and report them more. I don't know if that's understood, but it's a pretty big difference, 36 versus 22. It's almost, double. So I'm not sure. My hunch is that cannot all be a reporting issue, but I don't know. Wrestling, boys wrestling, 18. Boys basketball, girls softball.
So compare the girls' basketball and boys' basketball number, and it's threefold.
Yeah. My guess is that's not just reporting. I think it's because women's brains, maybe developing women, are more fragile. I don't know. But it shows up in the statistics a lot, that women often have a little more damage in sports than men do. There have been several high-profile athletes in the past 20 years, Steve Young, Troy Aikman, Eric Lindros, who are coming out as having been significantly concussed. There's a whole bunch of people right now suing the NFL, trying to get treatment and coverage for different injuries. It's a really big political issue. But we're having more, one of the theories in high school football, there's more injuries in the past few decades because the kids are bigger, stronger, faster, bigger kids. And this is not a new issue. When I was in high school, we had big football player kids in my high school, guys that were like 250 at like 17 years old. Big guys. We've often, sorry, question?
It just shows that we should have yoga in high school, don't you think?
I do think we should have yoga in high school, but to solve this problem.
That should be one of the major sports.
I mean, what we need, if we want to keep these impact sports going, we need to assess damage. I mean, concussion protocols are extremely forgiving now. You sit out for a few minutes, you're back to the next game. But we need better ways of assessing if a concussion just happened, and then have you not injure your brain for another month. That'd be the only way that I would think sports should continue like this, is if we're able to say, yes, that happened just now, concussion. Okay, sorry bud, you're taking a break for a month. We can't do that. In neuroimaging, unless things are very severe, they don't show up right away. In my EEG analysis, I see concussion stuff show up. I actually have people come in right after they have one. I don't see it right away unless it's very severe, and I see it at an impact spot. Usually 3-4 months later, I see where it shows up in the diffuse changes on the opposite side of the head or throughout the head. So I've seen this for a few people where they map, and over many months we see the concussion kind of bloom in the brain mapping, in the EEG. So it's not very easy to see right away in most of our current technologies, unfortunately.
A couple of thoughts while we're on sports. I mean, the role of boxing and mixed martial arts.
Most boxers and most MMA guys will have concussion history, and of course we know about boxers, punch drunk, chronically slurring their speech and being foggy. That's a post-concussive syndrome. That's basically advanced brain injuries. And I've done a lot of brain maps on fighters, MMA guys, and other things. And about half the MMA guys that I map have really dramatic injury patterns, like NFL players do typically, and they usually do have injury patterns in their brain.
Well, it's actually where I was going. Would boxing, mixed martial arts actually show a higher, both severity of injury and likelihood of injury than even NFL players? Or
I would guess
about the
not.
same category?
I don't know.
It's about- okay.
But I would guess the NFL players receive more damage.
Okay.
Because you're not generally throwing a 300-pound person at your head in a boxing ring. You know, you may have a serious amount of muscle coming at you, but it's not the same kind of accelerated force of a huge person. So my guess is less damage. I've also mapped the brains of several high-end MMA guys who show no damage whatsoever. One of them has never ever been hit in the head. He's like the world champion in kickboxing or something. Never, he goes and does meets and no one ever touches him. He's like the guy. I understand why there's no damage. Someone else is like, man, I've been knocked out so many times. You're gonna see something. That looks great. I'll be on TV later this year in May or June. Actually, no, next month I think. Mapping the brain of a guy who's had lots of. He's famous for banging his head on TV. Didn't see any concussions. So people are variable. You might have a moderate impact and have a big concussion. You might have a moderate impact and have no concussion. You just don't know. And that might be because of differences across individuals, or the same axis of force travels through different brains differently because of shapes of head. We don't know why, but we do know that you shouldn't hit your head.
Then one other question. I don't even know if it still happens in this country, but there used to be an auto sport called Demolition Derby.
Yeah.
Do they still do that?
They do some places, yeah. That will cause concussions. Yeah. I mean, think of a sport, you know? I mean, I don't think chess causes concussions, but, you know, if you're moving and there's the possibility of suddenly stopping moving, concussions happen. So, long-term effects include increased risk of dementia, among one of the biggest impacts. NFL players are getting dementia, some of them in their 40s and 50s. Guys retired 10 years later, they're no longer cognitively intact. This is a big problem in the NFL, certainly. It's very public, but it's happening as well in non-professional athletes, too. Here's an example of NFL brains, CTE. It's a progressive, basically you start damaging tissue. Once you have little seeds of damage, they spread. On the left here is normal brain. In the middle here is a 45-year-old former NFL guy. On the right-hand side is a 73-year-old boxer. Might answer your question, Randall. Now, difference in age, of course, and there's more damage here. I'm not sure if, you know, we just need some age match controls to tell you that question for sure. But it's not that dissimilar at a high tissue level, right? So, not sure. I also think people probably box later in life than they did when they play football, right, professionally. When do people retire in their football? 40, 37? And boxers are still boxing to their 40s, right? A lot of these big, famous guys are 40s, 50s. Defend their title. May not have anything to think about when they're done, but you know. Here's an 18-year-old high school athlete. Two documented concussions, that's it. Here's the seed of CTE showing up in his brain. This is a post-mortem autopsy, he died. But he was 18 years old.
Multi-sport injury?
No, he was a car accident or something. But this is not an acute injury. This is a chronic wear and tear injury that over time produces those little seeds of damage. So, not an isolated case. If you were able to, this is invasive imaging. If you're able to image the brains of every high school athlete who's been in a football game, I think we would suddenly stop having football, period. Because this is not unusual. This is something that's very, very common.
But there's no test for
There's no test for CTE when you're alive.
Okay.
And there's no test for things like Alzheimer's still officially. There are things you can do to go, whoa, something's wrong here, but you can't necessarily tell why. Now, from my perspective, that's okay because I work on the whole brain. I don't care why you have a problem. I don't care if it's a concussion classically or CTE or wear and tear or you're built that way. I will go after the resources and change them regardless of why they're there. If it's significant injuries, it'll just take a little longer, essentially.
Does neurofeedback, do you use that for aging?
I do
Brain
use
fog
neurofeedback for
and
aging.
Brain
I
fog.
do use it for brain fog and for processing speed, word finding things in aging.
You do?
And you know, essentially I use it for concussion for the same purposes. Brain
Yeah,
fog,
but
processing
for
speed,
aging.
deep sleep. Doesn't matter why you have the problem or the resource limit. What matters is you can point out and go, let's work on that. and then look in your brain and figure out why it's there, how it's looking, and exercise it. That can be from concussions. It could be from just living a long time. Doesn't really matter why. If you can come up with a resource to point at, we can probably go after it for you. So that's nice.
So what will diffusion tensor imaging show about either acute TBI or?
DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, for those who don't know, is an MRI-based technology that images the white matter tracks in the brain by looking at water molecules as they flow along the myelin, the axon of the brain. So you get wiring diagrams of the brain doing DTI. Most of the axons are inside the brain in the center and not on the outside. So for many concussions, if you're seeing crush injury, you wouldn't see any connectivity changes, nothing acute. You would see the local ones. For shear injuries, you would see dramatic snapping of wires, and you would see changes you see things just stopping instead of continuing through other parts of the brain. You would also see a lot of diffuse things because if you had shear damage in the axons, you no longer have simple axons, you have like cells dying in there, so it won't be quite as obvious. It'll be like a cluster of stripes instead of a single tract. DTI is still somewhat experimental, but it's really quite amazing what it can show. In October 2015, NFL commissioner went before the congressional subcommittee, and the NFL said, well, there's a problem, and the NFL concussion co-chairs just resigned. So people we appointed to the NFL commission to come up with policy both decided the problem is too big to solve, and they resigned just before this. So after that, NFL said they will hire neurologists to make return-to-play decisions on the field. But as I'm trying to impress to you, you don't actually recover in a time frame you can assess in a single game, or 2 games, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks perhaps. So, and I put the word independent in quotes here. You're independent, but you're working for the team, getting paid lots and lots of money. There's some incentive to continuing to work with the team. I'm not sure all these guys are all that independent. We certainly heard some horror stories historically in our sports about the team doctors shooting guys up with painkillers so I can play on injuries and things like that. I'm sure this happens the same way with brain injuries. Now, you don't have pain for brain injury. That's the thing. The brain, neurons, have no sensory nerve endings. The things we feel with are not present in the brain. It's odd. The thing that feels can't feel. So if you injure the tissue, you have no sense of the tissue being damaged. You cannot feel it. If your brain hurts, your head hurts, you're actually feeling things outside your brain. Your vasculature, blood vessels, muscles, the meninges, these layers of tissue that wrap the brain like paper-like layers, and inflammation outside the brain. That's what you're feeling. Your headache, it's blood vessels, not your neurons. You can't feel those. By the same token, you compress or tear the neurons, you can't feel that either. So you don't know subjectively the tissue damage. You cannot feel it. You can't feel the hurt. You can only feel the consequence of it, which can take some time to show up. NCAA followed the NFL, and their rule was, concussion, no return to play the same day. They had a more stringent rule. They had automatic not returning to play the same day. And basketball players can get concussed almost as badly as NFL guys, not for the same reason. Usually it's an elbow coming down or a body-to-body knocking somebody over.
Or a fall.
Exactly. But the NFL guys, when they fall, it's after 2 300-pound guys hit each other. Or you're getting ready to throw a ball and somebody sacks you out of nowhere, so you aren't resisting it, so you get a lot of ballistic force. So I don't know which of these is worse, but neither is great.
Don't they have lots of people jumping on you when you play football?
I think sometimes.
I've seen them.
Yeah, I think it depends on where you are in the
I'm
game.
not a football person.
Yeah. And people jumping on you won't cause concussions if you were already lying down.
Seen that.
They shouldn't cause concussions. Now you get a knee in the head maybe, but it shouldn't actually cause much concussion to be piled on top of. It's really movement and stopping movement that seems to cause a lot of the worst damage. Ballistic things that suddenly shift. Brain injuries can cause increased risk of dementia. For CTE, there's a long-term, lifelong increased risk. You can also look at an elder population. For those of you who don't know, I'm a gerontologist. I teach aging at UCLA. So I have this focus on peak aging and staying healthy throughout our whole lives and not slowing down and cranking resources up lifelong. And there are things that improve lifelong, like semantic information. Elders always have more knowledge than youngers do, always, in healthy aging. Always. Yeah, it never goes down. Semantic information just keeps climbing your whole life. So you'll always perform better than someone younger on recognition memory tasks, word identification tasks, things like that requires knowledge. Now, flexible use of your mind is harder when you get older. It's harder to use the existing knowledge in new ways. But using stuff you already got, you're always going to be better than somebody young. So if you look at elders, here's a study from JAMA. Here's 164,000 elders above 55 years old who had falls, of which 50,000 were diagnosed as mTBI or TBI. Of this 164,000 people, a quarter of them had increased risk of dementia versus a sample size, a control sample which did not have head injuries. And the biggest finding in this paper was you progress a lot faster, short progression. So 3.2 years of accelerated decline. This is the gap in injury versus no injury progression, essentially. So that's actually a big deal if you're already 60, 70, 80, to lose 3 years to dementia. If you're 90, that could be the rest of your life, right? So, and then moderate or mild TBI had an increased risk if you received it below 55, moderate TBI below 55 or even a mild one later in life. So as you get later and later in life, milder injuries cause more risk of dementia. The brain's less able to recover, essentially. I just wanted to throw this slide up, my favorite slides. Working memory is the scratch pad of your mind. It's RAM. How many things you can hold in your mind at once. I just tied together several things that working memory requires, or bottlenecks. So anything you experience in working memory. As you hear me now, hopefully, you're registering the information in your awareness, which is working memory. If you recall some information, you pull it out of storage into working memory. Anything you do with your mind or your thoughts, your awareness, your perception, you're perceiving in working memory. If working memory gets pinched, all of these things get thrown off. So a small change in working memory from concussion can take you out profoundly, subjectively in your resources, where you feel really impaired. Even if you might not be all that impaired, you can't hold things in your mind that much. That can get rid of all these other human resource problems. All right, let's start talking about things you can do. Here's several things on the screen. And rest is by far the biggest one. Again, I've been saying this all evening, but you should rest after concussion and not get a second concussion for at least 2 weeks of symptom-free time. This means no light sensitivity, no vertigo, no nausea, no afternoon fatigue, no irritability. Now, maybe you guys have those anyways, but you should definitely think you're beyond them. Anti-inflammatory drugs can sometimes improve symptoms, at least transiently. Hydration. A lot of people with chronic concussion stuff seem to be dehydrated.
What are you saying? What would you consider an anti-inflammatory?
NSAIDs, aspirin, ibuprofen, those sorts of things can cause changes.
But isn't there some discussion about the
Protective?
Well, no, the what do they call it? The kickback headache, the
Rebound
headache with the NSAIDs.
Yeah, it can happen. But the goal here is to reduce the chronic inflammation. So the acute inflammation is not about dropping your headache. It's about gradually reducing inflammation over many, many days and months. And there's other things you can do besides drugs. You could do like ice baths.
Okay.
Or if you're not going to get, many times you can get exacerbation of symptoms with sauna, with heat. But if you don't get exacerbation of symptoms, you probably should be doing it a few times a week to break up all the tissue, make it move around, flow, stuff through there. Most people with concussion stuff will do a sauna and feel worse for a day or two afterwards. So you
I know some people that do a sauna at this one place and then go to the cold
that's the traditional way to do sauna.
I do that.
Yeah, it's great to do sauna that way.
Is that good?
It's great.
It is. However, if you have a concussion, chances are about equal. You will get dramatic worsening of symptoms with a sauna. You should not go and do it again.
So how about just cryotherapy?
Just cryo, ice baths, standing in
That's
nitrogen.
better for you than a
To reduce
sauna.
systemic inflammation, yeah. But a lot of it isn't going to get deep into the brain. So it's hard. I mean, I think ice baths are better than cryotherapy, actually. Like sitting up to your neck in ice and breathing through the pain. That will reduce systemic inflammation faster than almost anything else. And so will dropping sugar out of your diet.
Oh, I agree with that.
So you could also just do some diet arrangement, increase the good fats, drop the sugar completely out, no starch whatsoever. A ketogenic diet is a fairly brain healthy, anti-inflammatory diet, so you can drop some symptoms of nutrition by just going full blown keto or no carbohydrates whatsoever. Mindfulness. If you're not acute in your symptoms, then meditation can rebuild those same executive function resources over time, really reliably. Neurofeedback and brain mapping can often help you pinpoint the specific difficulty, help you understand it better. Oh, okay, it's just this thing happening, not me feeling crazy or weak or whatever. It really is quite useful to look at your brain and go, oh, this is probably what's happening. I find it really useful myself, and most of my clients will find it very freeing to realize, oh, okay, it's a real thing. So now that you don't know you were injured, but you can see the consequences and then see them change over time.
The change is the really
Is that nice?
cool. Oh yeah, that helps a lot.
Yeah, the second, third, fourth,
Yeah.
you map your brain, you're like, yep, getting better and
2 or 3
better.
standard deviations, yes.
And of course you feel different, which is really what matters. But when you see the physiology change matching what you're feeling, you trust feeling better, a little bit better, right? And oh, okay, yes, I'm actually past it. So, nootropics, these are brain supplements that tend to have pro brain function and anti-aging qualities. This is kind of a loaded term, nootropics, and if you look for it, you'll find that lots of people are using this word in ways it should not be used. Strictly speaking, a nootropic improves brain health, reduces damage from injuries, reduces aging issues without side effects.
What is a nootropic?
What is a nootropic?
Name a couple.
Tyrosine, theanine, piracetam, choline sources like CDP-choline or alpha-GPC. These all have minimal or manageable side effects. Things like caffeine, modafinil, Adderall, not nootropics, because they have side effects. If it has a side effect, not a nootropic. And most nootropics are almost nutritive. They're sort of like amino acids or the raw material for neurotransmitters. So like tyrosine is the raw material for dopamine. If you take a dopamine drug, it's called a stimulant, it's habit forming, overactivates tissue. If you take tyrosine, it feeds dopamine neurons, the raw material, you don't get any overactivation, no habit forming, no stimulant effect, but you still feed the dopamine system. So you can feed the brain and help it drop inflammation, improve metabolism, and improve oxygenation. The first nootropic developed, I think, in 1976. It's called Piracetam, Piracetam. And Piracetam is really similar in structure to the neurotransmitter GABA, which is this inhibitory, relaxing neurotransmitter. And the story may be apocryphal, but I think it's valid, that scientists in Belgium were looking for a sleep drug. This has been a holy grail of pharmacologists for years, trying to find a drug that causes sleep. There are no drugs that cause sleep. They don't exist. Sleeping medications cause a hypnotic state, and then maybe you fall asleep thereafter. But there's nothing that triggers sleep on the market. There has never been. So this is always a holy grail of psychopharmacologists. So they every so often will try different things, and GABA is the universally calming neurotransmitter, so it was a good candidate. So making modifications to GABA and looking at what it did, and one of them, instead of causing sedation or relaxation, caused improvements in memory and attention in animals, like dramatic. And then they started using it after that in humans.
That's piracetam.
Piracetam.
Yeah.
Started using it in humans for drowning and for alcoholism recovery. Because if you drown, you have a hypoxic event, you have an injury from lack of oxygen. And it
But what did you say piracetam is good for? What did you just say?
alcoholism,
See, I didn't get
brain
that.
injuries.
No, they're too good.
Yeah. Anything where you need more oxygenation. It seems to improve the tissue flexibility, oxygenation, etc. And it's also anti-aging, quite lovely. It works great for concussions. It's also not used in this country as a drug. It's used in most other countries as a drug for mild Alzheimer's, ADHD, concussions, other problems. In this country, we have other drugs serving those same roles that have gotten to the marketplace first, like stimulants. But in most countries, the racetam class of drugs is still used as psychoactive compounds. There's one of the drugs in that category that's really heavy duty used in this country for anti-seizure called levetiracetam. But it's not like one of the nootropics, it's an anti-seizure drug, major side effects. But most of the racetams are names like piracetam, oxiracetam, aniracetam, phenylpiracetam. Those are mildly stimulating for cognition, word finding, clarity of thought, deeper sleep, and they tend to improve brain health long term.
So if we're talking about enhancing GABA, can we visit on acute TBI the glutamate flood that occurs?
Yeah, so when there is an impact, tissue is ripped apart or crushed, and neurotransmitters are spilled into the surrounding tissue. Now, unlike the blood supply, neurotransmitters do not release themselves into circulation. You have two neurons talking to each other in a synapse, a little gap, and there's a little pouch sealing that environment up. And so when a neurotransmitter is released, it's released where it's used, not into circulation. So if the brain sees neurotransmitters floating around throughout the brain, it's a big deal, or blood, it's a big deal. It's really dangerous for the brain. So glial cells rush in and form scar tissues in damaged parts of the brain where there's leaking neurotransmitters, usually glutamate. There's two big neurotransmitters in the brain that are used as like master switches for excitation, activating tissue, or reducing tissue activation. Glutamate and GABA. And GABA is only inhibitory in adults, and glutamate's only excitatory in adults. It's different in babies, but in adults they become these on-off switches. These are very carefully balanced. If you have too much GABA, you pass out. Too much glutamate, you have seizures. This is why alcohol makes you pass out, because alcohol releases GABA in the brain dramatically. This is why chronic alcoholics, years of drinking, in the absence of alcohol, glutamate climbs, they have seizures and cardiovascular events. So that balance is really critical. With an injury, glutamate rushing everywhere, the brain's like, oh my gosh, excitatory neurotransmitters, we could be having seizures, inflammation, and glial cells rush in, form scar tissue, and sop up. They soak up all the extra glutamate. And for whatever reason, about a decade later, they often start manufacturing glutamate, glial cells, and pumping out little glutamate bursts. And that is the kindling focus for the seizure that happens in some acute brain injuries a decade later.
Interesting. You know, I see some people that are doing CBD. What do you think of that?
Cannabinoids are generally anti-inflammatory. Human beings have a couple of endocannabinoid systems in the body and brain.
That's what they say. Okay.
And they're used for, one of them is used for immune system and inflammation, and one is used for bliss.
Oh.
There's a compound in the human body called anandamide,
Yeah.
naturally occurring. Ananda is the Sanskrit word for bliss.
Yeah, it is.
We didn't discover anandamide until after we discovered the cannabinoid receptors binding to
The
cannabis.
receptor side, yeah.
So we named the receptors off of the cannabinoids.
Ananda.
But then later on, the endogenous cannabinoid is anandamide, one of them. We have several.
That's
So,
all used is for sleep.
well, cannabinoids are generally sedating and cause anti-inflammatory effects and cause activation of slow brain waves. So the anti-inflammatory effects are really good for concussion and for sleep and anxiety and things like that. But there's not necessarily a strong case to be made that, here's the thing, we don't know enough broadly. There's 67 cannabinoids, we're talking about 3 these days, CBN, CBD, THC. They all have pro-health things going on, they all have anti-inflammatory things, but we don't understand them that well. And we don't really understand the endocannabinoid systems that well at all. So people are using them, you're absolutely right, and getting benefits, anti-inflammatory, pro-sleep, calming effects. That's as far as we should take the conversation. We don't know more than that.
That's what they tell me. These aren't people that necessarily have concussions either.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just
Well, CBD and CBN are used broadly everywhere now because they're not psychoactive, and I think every state allows CBD
Okay.
over the counter. So you can buy CBD, people getting CBD chews and things for arthritis and sleep and anxiety, and give it to your pets and stuff like that. So it's everywhere in the marketplace, but we're just scratching the surface in that landscape, and there are many, 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 many more cannabinoids, both endogenously and exogenously, that we're starting to figure out what they do, including immune functions. You know, so it's a really interesting system,
Interesting.
but it's way more complex than
We know it.
we know at this point, I think, yeah. And what you're describing is a marketplace effect leading,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
a science effect
They're
leading,
not
as far as I know.
doctors giving it to them.
The last thing on this page is scaffolding. If you can't keep track of things in your mind, write it down, or use other tricks and techniques. Like keeping a list of things or getting things done. David Allen's book about getting things out of your head into a system so you don't have to keep tracking all the things in your head. I'm going to go quickly through all of these now. I already talked a little bit about them, but
Can I go back to improving oxygenation?
yeah.
Deep breathing work, would that be?
A little bit. For improving oxygenation for neural stuff, you need to use HEG, hemoencephalography, which we do here for biofeedback on the blood flow, or you can do hyperbaric oxygen.
That was my next
Oh,
question.
But hyperbaric oxygen, as done by biohackers, these little tents you get in, is not useful. That's for wound healing, for skin healing. You need like multiple atmospheres
Like
for
3
neural.
atmosphere or more.
Like Navy diving bells and recovery bells and things. Like
Oh
the
my goodness.
serious giant metal machines you climb into that are rooms. Little
Hospital
tents
grade
do,
stuff.
yeah, exactly. Little tents for biohackers do not do much to the brain. You can't get the oxygen in. It's just not going to work.
Yeah.
So, but high pressure, 3, 4, 5, 8 atmospheres. Now you're talking neuro rehab, absolutely. But it's so it's really interesting. I don't have a hyperbaric oxygen chamber of that type, So I tend to do all the oxygenation work through HEG by doing biofeedback on your brain's own blood flow to increase the blood flow to drive up oxygenation and teach your brain how to do it versus from the outside in.
What's the time to effect on that? How many sessions or how much? I mean, how long does it take for HG to kick in?
A few. You feel it within a few sessions, usually.
3, 4, 5?
Yep, somewhere in there. People are variable. So it's like, how long did you feel the gym? Well, how in shape were you to start with? And how much are you aware of your internal states? Somewhere between 3 and 5 sessions, neurofeedback protocols generally are experienceable by most people. And when changing protocols, you feel the difference usually within a couple of sessions. But some people don't feel it that much. Some people feel it incredibly powerfully. So it's hard to say subjectively. But I get migraine reduction, which is a vascular issue, within about, I don't know, 5 or 10, would you guys say? Is that what you for migraine reduction? 5 or 10 sessions of HEG. We usually get drops in severity first and then incidence afterwards with HEG, or hemoencephalography, infrared blood flow training. And we use a form called PIR, passive infrared, which is just an infrared camera pointing inward. There's other variants of HEG I don't like, but PIR HEG is my favorite for migraines that are vascular. So if you have a concussion, I'll do PIR to build the blood vessel flow as well as EEG training to rebuild the tissue itself. So I tend to go after it from multiple ways.
And then how about neuromodulation for TBI, electrical stimulation?
I don't like it. I don't like neuromodulation, period. It doesn't work that well. I mean, the best neuromodulation is TMS. And that's like 2/3 efficacy at best, and it's transient. So if you're in acute depression and you're suicidal and TMS works for you, great. Let's go do some, lift the depression, let's build some strategies in your life to help support so it wears off, you actually have made some progress. I'd rather just teach your brain to change itself permanently than lean in and try to shift things from the outside. So I'm really whenever people ask about neuromodulation or neurostimulation, I think that it's a brute force effect that is not that effective for most people. And while less noticeable, biofeedback actually makes more change over time and more permanent change for most people. So I'm kind of opposed to neuromodulation as a technique because I think it's not nearly as effective as most other things that are much less invasive.
Oh yeah, and I get it. And devil's advocate, that study at Yale on ECT that showed neurogenesis in the hippocampus.
Oh, ECT is something different. That's special. I worked at an ECT center at McLean Hospital, actually, for a little while. Now ECT is done very differently than what you may have seen in the movies, 50, 60 years ago. It doesn't cause much in the way of convulsions. It doesn't cause much in the way of memory loss. But my theory is that ECT for intractable depression and for and other things like TMS for depression, like ibogaine for drug addiction, like ketamine for depression. I think all of these things are doing a similar mechanism causing a reset, rebooting the computer.
Yeah.
And in depression, there's some evidence for this because anything that lifts depression does so by causing plasticity increases in the hippocampus. So anything that lifts depression shows shows new cell growth. Anything. So I'm not all that impressed by TMS showing new neurons, okay? Since this morning you've made 700 neurons, okay? I want to see more before I'm going to endorse it as a useful thing. I think it's an interesting, I live in Los Angeles, there's like 47 TMS centers in Santa Monica for depression, and people use them and get great benefits.
And it got a code and it's getting paid for.
Well, things getting paid for by insurance companies is not my threshold for adoption,
Believe me, I get that.
So let me quickly run through some interventions to give you some actionable things to do, and then answering questions you might have. Mindfulness. If you're not in acute anxiety, mindfulness or meditation can rebuild your frontal lobe and cause better executive function at any age and from any starting place. I break meditation down to 3 different classic forms, and this is sort of my categorization. Single point awareness, present time awareness, and feeling tone or loving kindness awareness. And these are actually tracked to classic ancient mindfulness techniques. So single point awareness is called samatha, or concentration practices, absorption practices, which you might know as Mahayana Buddhism. Present time awareness would be vipassana, or insight, or Theravada Buddhism. And then emotional awareness would be like loving kindness, or metta, it used to be called, or is called. And then you have other types of things where you anchor on like mantras, a sound, a color, something your teacher gave you. In all of these cases, the process of meditation or mindfulness is deciding what to anchor on, which of these things you should focus on, and then noticing when you aren't focusing, letting it go, going back to the anchor again and again and again. It's just a rep every day for a few weeks will make a change in cognitive function. Cognitive training games are probably not worth doing. Short answer, the research is incredibly weak on all cognitive training. It doesn't seem to do anything. Even if you get improvements on the game you're doing, the same resource in a different context shows no change. So cognitive training, Sudoku, Lumosity, all these things are probably a waste of money. Staying active at all with your mind versus not active is good. It doesn't have to be these specific things though. Anything you do with your mind will be good. These specific training things do not seem to work on the resources they say they work on. There's one exception, the dual end back, which is a cognitive training game, and you can get, there's a free version of it here. About half the research says there's no effect. About half the research says there's some small effect. And that's the best of any cognitive training that exists. So the game will flash in this tic-tac-toe grid a square, or it'll speak over the speakers a letter. And if it's a dual 2 back, this is a 2, then you're trying to remember what happened 2 trials previously, and is there a match in the position or the letter? So you're holding 2 things in your mind, the dual, several trials back, the N, and then the back. So it's a working memory thing. You load up your attention, and then you try to hold it over time, shifting. So it builds working memory. This is the #1 thing that human resources can be improved by, except there's very little evidence you can actually improve it. But if you want to try something, this is probably the only thing worth trying. Neurofeedback, this is something we do a lot here. Brain training and brain mapping. I've already mentioned a few of the things we see in concussion. Delta from crush, extra fast frequencies from shear, connectivity changes sometimes. And mostly neurofeedback is about creating plasticity in the direction you want, deciding which direction your brain wants to change in, because plasticity is a built-in resource. Your brain shifts, that's what it does. But with neurofeedback, you can choose which direction it shifts in and get effects much faster than otherwise. We sometimes see markers in the brain for injuries, for non-specific things that might be injuries, for weird processing problems or other resource images. Here's an example of somebody who had a TBI with loss of consciousness. This person had a coup injury from the side, and they have impact on both sides of the head. So there's a shear injury right there, and a crush injury on that side, basically. So you can see the amplitude differences. In the top row, you can see some connectivity differences down here, really diffuse connectivity changes. Really big injury. And this is a bell curve. So this person has 3 standard deviations excess, where things are the brightest colors. So really pretty poor impact.
So how is it not a crush injury on the right side? I mean, I see the shear and high beta, but
You don't get high beta from crush.
can't be both?
No, it is both.
But crush on the right as well as shear on the right.
No, there is.
Okay,
Yeah, crush on the right, shear on the right, crush on the left,
okay.
no shear on the left.
thank you.
So you're getting crushed on both
Yeah.
sides. Probably the brain bounced, but it probably bounced with a twist. And that's what produced this. Same person, after 30 sessions of neurofeedback over 6 weeks. I'll go back and forth. Pre, look at the upper right, post. Now you're seeing, 6 weeks later, where the impact was. You didn't see it right away. What you're seeing right away, right away you're seeing the contra coup. But 6 weeks later, we actually addressed the contra coup and trained it down, and the actual injury was finally showing up. So
What functional deficit would he have had with that high beta loss at P3, or that increase in high beta at P3?
here,
Yeah, I mean, what symptoms would that bring on?
this would produce a lot of brain fog, a lot of fatigue. This would probably produce a lot of anxiety, actually, and probably some actually depression. Right front beta is depression usually. We've also got some asymmetry markers right here, right, Randall? So these are depression
Pretty thick,
markers. Yeah, frontal lobe that's reversed activation sometimes means depression. So this person, I would have guessed, was really foggy and fatigued, completely wiped out, anxious, and depressed.
Okay.
Now, brain mapping is a hypothesis generator. I wouldn't say this is true for you. I would say, this often shows up this way. Does this sound right? Does that sound right? Is this important? Is this meaningful to you? And as much as it made sense, then I would believe it, not the other way around. But this person had some, look at the connectivity changes at the bottom. Those cleaned up nicely. Those are long-term changes usually. So there's pre and there's post. About half the damage, if you will, cleaned up in 6 weeks. I mentioned nootropics already. You were asking, Peggy, some examples.
Yeah.
Here's the poster children of nootropics. Piracetam and acetylcholine. Those are the number 1 and 2 I would recommend you go after. Also, maybe just this one. This is a very simple one, L-theanine. L-theanine releases GABA in the brain, very calming. And so you can combine L-theanine with a non-nootropic caffeine, you get a really nice smooth push to your caffeine. So swallow your L-theanine pill from Amazon with a cup of coffee.
My caffeine pill, you're in there.
And then you end up with this like really nice sort of in between 2 stress and 2 relax if you combine the 2. This is a great stack to combine together. Or for sleep, you can combine L-theanine and GABA. Because GABA doesn't get in the brain by itself, but L-theanine does and turns into GABA. So if you have GABA out to the brain, L-theanine inside, you get more sucked in. So you get pro-sleep onset issues combining L-theanine and GABA, for instance. These are nutritive, I would call them, nootropics. Carnitine and tyrosine. Carnitine is a raw material for mitochondria to make energy, and tyrosine is the raw material for dopamine, so focus, concentration, alertness. Fat. You need fat. The brain is 2/3 DHA when you're born, or more. And DHA is a good fat that the brain will rebuild itself from, and it oxidizes very, very slowly, so it's a stable fat to build your brain from. DHA is from the ocean floor, from algae, mostly. Not the ocean floor, from the ocean. And when you get it from fish, they've got it from krill, who get it from the algae. So you can actually go right after algal forms of DHA and bypass the entire food supply if you want to. And then just a disclaimer, I created this nootropic. This is my a project I worked on a few years ago, which contains the 7 or 8 basic nootropics that you should start with. And we also
One pill? One pill?
No, it's either a packet of liquid, a little energy drink, or it's a morning and a midday packet of capsules with like 3 capsules in one and 3 in the other, I think. So it's, but we're also completely transparent to all the ingredients. The recommendation is to go on the website and dig through all the ingredient lists and see what makes sense to you. You know?
Your website?
No, the TrueBrain website.
TrueBrain website.
Yeah, I was involved with TrueBrain when they launched the company. I created all the products initially.
Yeah.
But I'm not involved with it anymore. We do have we do have seconds of the TrueBrain drinks here though, typically. Because we have seconds, so the drinks are little 1 ounce packets, and occasionally at the manufacturing plant, one will explode and stain the bottom of a bunch of them, or like underfilled or overfilled. They can't sell them. And so all the seconds get put in a pile, and once a month, they just for a nickel a piece, they send them to us just for the shipping. So we tend to have lots of seconds here for you to grab handfuls
We could
of.
try one.
Yeah. We only have the drinks here, not the capsules, and the drinks are all caffeinated, or most of them are caffeinated. So
That's nice. You would take it in the morning.
for you, it's, yeah, just don't mix it with your caffeine pill.
No.
Because it's got 80 or 100 milligrams of caffeine in it.
Does it? Okay.
So you don't want to double your caffeine. You would not.
Remember my coach.
Nutrition. Most nutrition strategies are about reducing inflammation. The short answer is you can go to keto if you're acute. If you're not acute, you probably don't need to. And instead of doing a hardcore ketogenic diet, I like these other variants called paleo or primal. I'm a big fan of primal because it's the least culty of all the paleo diets, I think. And Mark Sisson, Mark Deli Apple, is an Olympic athlete who developed the primal version, and I'm a big fan of it. It minimizes
Like paleo?
similar, doesn't vilify dairy to the same degree, and it has much more emphasis on the nutritional profile of your food and in limiting carb intake, the way paleo is not quite as focused on. So it's a little more brain healthy and a little easier to do. It's less of a diet, more of like an easy lifestyle to adopt.
What about the vegan?
My short, blunt answer on that is being vegan is a great way to destroy your brain, your teeth, and your rest of your health. There's no way to eat vegan in a brain healthy way. There's ethical reasons to eat vegan, perhaps, but I don't think, I mean, people are variable. People have different metabolisms and different strategies, but I think as an organism, we need animal fats. We need animal and proteins. I really do think that's true. Now, people disagree with me here, but that's my take on it. And most vegan diets are not nutritionally complete. Even people that are trying to do it often don't. So if your question about being a vegan, I would challenge you to think about some of like the vegan 2.0 stuff happening now, like using mussels as a protein source. A lot of vegans I know are eating mussels now because they have primitive nervous systems, they don't move, they don't feel pain, they can be sustainably farmed without any impact. So a lot of vegans are adopting foods that fit the ethical criteria but are still animals, like mussels.
My doctor suggested a vegan diet, but it's not an ethical thing. It was just for the anti-inflammatory part of it.
You get more anti-inflammatory effect dropping sugar and starch out of your diet. Fat and protein are anti-inflammatory in the absence of sugar and starch. In the presence of sugar and starch, they're super pro-inflammatory. Essentially, you can go either extreme and drop inflammation. If you go hardcore fat and protein, you drop it more than if you go hardcore starch and whole grains and things like that. And many humans are a little sensitive to lectins and legumes and things in starch and grains, so I think fewer humans are sensitive to a pure meat diet than are sensitive to a pure plant diet.
What's your dialogue behind the bullet of disruption of sleep with respect to nutrition?
You can improve the disruption of sleep by dropping the inflammation. And you can also eat fat earlier in the day and cause much more energy late in the day. So you go to sleep with insulin sort of in a moderate range, and a low or a high range.
So insulin.
But honestly, about nutrition and insulin, the most important thing is not eat for a few hours before bed. Because if you eat before bed, you'll fall asleep with high insulin, you'll suppress the growth hormone release that happens 1 to 2 hours later. You'll therefore suppress the ghrelin release late in the night, and
What's
suppress
that?
it's the satiety hormone. And then you'll suppress the cortisol burst that happens at 5 a.m. to wake you up. And so you wake up tired and not having felt rested if you eat within a few hours before bed. So don't eat within a few hours before bed. Scaffolding, here's some tricks. I'm a big fan of this when I can't get work done. It's called Pomodoro, after the tomato. So it's a 25-minute timer with a 5-minute bell. So you do 25 minutes and you have to sprint through your work. And you have to take the break when it goes off. You can't keep working. So you structure your work times instead of your lazy times. Or vice versa, actually. Structure your breaks, and you have to keep pushing through the 25 minutes. This is not to be minimized. You might need some support. You might need help structuring all the things that were fine once you didn't have a concussion. Now you have a concussion, you can't handle the bills, this, that, the other. Nothing wrong with getting some support, really. And I'm a big fan of keeping things in the cloud. Using Evernote, using Dropbox. I used to do a lot of David Allen's Getting Things Done, but now I have too many things to do. So, no, I'm kidding. The reason I don't use GTD anymore is because I'm not managing my own tasks. I'm managing 50 people's tasks, well, 25. So it just isn't a good use for me. And besides, I don't have to remember what I have to do anymore because my staff reminds me. We need this report. Oh, okay, I'll get to it. So, sleep. Sleep and attention are related. We don't understand how, except the sleep spindles keep you asleep is also the main brainwave to bring up stability, to reduce seizures, to reduce ADHD, to reduce anxiety. This SMR, this sensory motor rhythm, SMR. And SMR, if you see a cat lying on a windowsill, you've seen SMR. That liquid body, but laser-like focus as it watches birds outside. That inhibited body, soft body, but sharp mind, is SMR. It's predators can leap into action from relaxation faster than from tension, right? So the more you can relax at the starting line, the faster you can move. So predators are extremely good at shutting down the body muscles when they see a prey animal. So humans, if you train up SMR, you reduce seizures and eliminate ADHD, because SMR is the opposite of ADHD. Motorically inhibited, mentally calm, versus fidgety and scattered. You'll see sleep changes. Parasomnias and other things can show up in both typical sleep issues as well as concussion. There's lots of things you have to think about with sleep. Mostly it's photoperiod entrainment, or dragging your rhythm back in line with the Earth's rhythm. And as I already mentioned, the most important thing to do there is not to eat in the evening. The next most important thing to do is to minimize bright lights in the evening. The third most important thing to do is to get good morning sunlight. But eating is actually a bigger cue by far on your circadian rhythm than is light. So
How many hours?
at least 3 between finishing dinner and going to bed.
What do you say is the difficulty if you eat before you go to sleep?
If you eat before you go to sleep,
Or
you
within
fall
an
asleep
hour.
with high insulin. You suppress all the hormones throughout the night that should be cascading and changing. And you wake up in the morning without having had the hormone regulation. No growth hormone, no deep sleep, no cortisol. You wake up hungry in the morning. It's several things that have to happen in a staged way for good sleep architecture and your hormones. And those are all suppressed if you go into bed with high insulin.
So 3 hours.
At least
What
3.
happens if you work like just don't eat?
Yeah, just don't eat.
Just
Don't
dinner?
eat, just fast. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Fasting is extremely good for your brain, actually, really anti-inflammatory.
Okay.
A 3-day fast reboots the entire immune system. Through an autophagy effect, causes the body to kill any dead cells, eat them all, and create new cells, and then cause an immune boost. Just a couple things. Melatonin doesn't seem to do very much for most people. It's not useful to do if you're having other big sleep issues like concussion-driven fog. It won't improve you. Also, most people doing melatonin are doing massively high doses. The effective dose of melatonin is under 1 milligram. Most preparations are 20 to 50 milligrams now on the shelves. Under 1 milligram is the effective dose. Between about 5 and about 20 milligrams, you get suppression effects, and over 20 or so, you get effects again. But you get effects for 2 or 3 days sometimes with high doses. So if you don't take a super low dose of melatonin, you're probably delaying the efficacy of the melatonin for that night and getting rebound effects and suppression the next night. So if you like melatonin, great, but try 0.5 milligram and you may be shocked that it works better than the 10 milligrams or 20 milligrams you're taking now, because it really is a sweet spot for melatonin.
Does potency or caliber of the supplement make a difference?
I'm not sure what those words mean with regards to melatonin. If it's melatonin, it's melatonin. It's a neurotransmitter.
Okay.
You know, potency is about percentage, so maybe there's other stuff in there, but not sure.
Okay.
All right, in summary,
Well, some melatonin is alcohol.
but that's not about the melatonin. That's about the preparation, you know. So
Okay.
I'm not a fan of melatonin. I think you'd be better off just teaching your brain how to fall asleep at night by timing your eating, timing your sleeping, getting morning light, fasting from 2 p.m. on if you have to tell your brain it's the end of the day. You can probably do it for like 6 p.m. on or 7 p.m. on. It'd be good. But if that isn't working, push your fasting window back until you're fasting for many hours at the end of the day. You'll fall asleep easier.
I fall asleep fine.
Great.
Just getting in the middle of it.
So, in summary, lots of things change in concussion, and lots of us can get concussion even without severe injuries. And it has an effect on attention, but shift happens. So get yours. Take control of your brain health. If your brain isn't doing what you want it to do, you don't have to tolerate it. You can get sharper, crisper, more rested, more creative, more alert, or almost anything else you can perceive of if you can go after it with lots of strategies. So don't be satisfied with being stuck in a post-concussive syndrome. Fog, fatigue, irritable, stress, because you don't actually have to stay there. Things can change, even though change fast. Even if the things you're working on aren't actually making a big impact, just keep trying different things, because brains sometimes change very slowly, and different people need different strategies sometimes. So brains do, however, change. There's no brain that will stay how it is today in a few weeks. So use that changeability and try to steer it with the different things we're talking about. All right, thank you guys.
No questions in
Cool.
the feeds.
Any other questions for you guys?
Thank you. This is
Thank
very.
you, Doctor.
Cool, thanks.
very-
So we haven't picked the topic for the next one. It's on March 13th, I think?
No, this is
Sorry,
March.
April 13th? I think the 13th.
I'm not sure.
It's in about a month.
Yeah, but you don't know.
We don't know what topic, I don't think I picked the topic yet. I might do a general intro to neurofeedback one. That's what I was thinking of. But if there's another topic you would like me to do more specifically, in my intro one I'll show you more brain mapping results, pre-post, dig into the technology a lot more. But I can do other topics, so if there's things you'd like to hear, let me know the next few days and I'll pull something else out. Otherwise, I'll probably just do a general, here's what neurofeedback and brain mapping is, and people sometimes really enjoy that one if they haven't seen it in a while. And even you, Laura, you're kind of an expert now in neurofeedback. You might enjoy seeing all the intro stuff again.
I might retain
So.
it better now that I've had shift happen.
You should. That's right. That's right. Great.
A user online says they'd love more of these.
Well, we'll do more of these. That's great. Thank you. All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You guys can kill the cameras.
Hey, I have a question about the